Welcome to the Navigating Disruption podcast. I'm your host, Shaquille Barmel. I'm the CEO of Ocean Blue Strategic and partner with the Summit Group. I'm a coach, consultant, and speaker, and I help leaders, entrepreneurs, and sales professionals make an impact through improved performance. In this podcast, I share insights and interviews with interesting leaders to define practical lessons that you can use to make an impact in the face of uncertainty. We are proud to be supported by the Summit Group, helping companies to increase revenue, deepen customer relationships by moving from sales excellence to business relevance through transformative and engaging learning experiences. I hope you had a lovely holiday in this very unusual year. In this episode, I speak to Amyn Bhimani, the president of Hetek Solutions. The company is a 65-year-old national provider of industrial commercial detection products and services. He and I found a remarkable and unique partnership 30 years ago when an inspiring and commanding woman took a chance on us. In this conversation, we dive into the intricacies of our collaboration and our friendship, what we learned about leadership way back then, and how those lessons prepared us for the rest of our careers. And in fact, prepared us for this time. Enjoy the conversation.
Hey, Shaquille.
Hey, Amyn, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Are you in the office today?
Yeah.
What's the mood around there as the holidays approach?
It's pretty positive. Yeah, the mood's pretty good. It's obviously been a tough year, like it has been for everybody, but people have really appreciated the steps that we've taken to keep everybody whole for the most part. We had to do some layoffs at the beginning, but we brought everybody back full time. Our number of staff has actually grown this year. And the really incredible thing is the feedback that I've been getting is we're a better team now than we were in January. And I think that's just everybody really sort of saying, hey, we're going to all have to step up here and work together to get through this thing. And everybody's going to do things that they normally wouldn't do. And we're going to be patient with each other and we're going to step in and help where we can. And yeah, I'm really, really proud of the team. I mean, I think in these situations, everybody has a choice on how to respond, right?
Right, yeah.
And you can respond by taking a me first attitude. And I'm really proud of our team that they haven't done that. It's really been, how do we all come together and get through this thing? We know it's going to be hard. All of us are sacrificing something, some people more than others, but everybody is sacrificing something. So let's not get into who's doing what for whom, and let's just all do what we need to do to get through.
Yeah,
So the mood right now is actually, the morale here right now is probably better than it's been since I can remember, since we moved.
Wow, that's fascinating. It's amazing that this time has really brought out the best in most of us, right?
Yeah.
Most of the people I've engaged with have said that they've grown, learned things, seen things in other people that has really reinforced their kind of belief in humanity.
Yeah,
And
it is weird because when you listen to the news,
right,
and it doesn't feel that way at all.
right,
It's so negative. But then when you actually talk to normal people,
yeah,
everybody has their moments, right? And everybody's got their own stuff going on. And I know for some of our team, it's been really hard because of whatever personal things they had going on or whatever else. But, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, we can't control it, but let's focus on what we can control
yeah,
and do that really well. And I think people have for the most part, have done that.
yeah. Was that your initial messaging when all this started happening, that you portrayed that sense to the team, or is it something that naturally existed in your team?
I think for me, I never try to, unless I'm in a one-on-one coaching situation, I really try not to, when I'm in communicating to the group, I really try not to prescribe, because I find two things happen. One is people either think that prescription doesn't apply to them, right? Because you're not addressing it to anybody. And as a leader, you don't know enough about what everybody's going through to actually do that well. And so my approach was, I'm going to try to be really, really honest about where we're at as a company, how I'm feeling, where my head's at, and why we're making the decisions that we're making. And so right from the very beginning, the message that we went out to the team with was, all of our decisions that we're going to make through this thing, because, in March, The situation was literally changing daily, if not quicker than that. We didn't know what government support there was going to be.
Hmm.
We didn't know how our customers were going to react. We didn't know whether or not a lot of our work ultimately got deemed essential, which was great for us. But we didn't know that at the very beginning. We didn't know any of these things. So what we did is we went out and we said, look, these are the three principles that we're going to make all of our decisions on. So one was we wanted to the extent that we can, have a strategy that would keep our team whole from a financial basis to
Okay.
the extent that we could do that. And then two, we were really going to focus on the long-term health of the company. So we accepted the fact that, hey, this could be really, really tough for us, but the decisions that we're making are going to be based on the long term health of the company. And three, we're going to make sure that our people were safe and healthy. So every decision that we made, we tried to bring it back to those three sort of guiding principles and then be really, really honest with people about what was going on and where my head was at. In these situations, I think, or in any situation, the greatest anxiety comes from uncertainty.
Hmm.
And so in a situation like this, whereas even as leaders, there was so much uncertainty, you didn't know what decisions you were going to make. And so I didn't try to sugarcoat anything. I didn't try to give anybody a false sense of security. Just tried to say, these are the guiding principles that we're going to follow, and all of our decisions are going to be based around this. And then every time we made a decision, bring it back to those things and say, this decision we're making, this is why we're making it, and this is how it relates to these guiding principles. And I think that's all you can do. And even now, with the whichever wave we're on now, it's the same thing, right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So we just continue to do that. We're very blessed that right now we've got everybody working full time. We're doing relatively well. And so far we've come out of everything okay. And that's a blessing.
Well, let's thank you for that summary. I mean, the key things I took away from there is you tried to be very honest with your team and you shared what you were feeling, what you were going through. And I'm sure that included some vulnerability, letting them know the things you didn't know the answers to and that you were figuring things out just as everybody else was. And three, explaining the rationale of the decisions you're making so they understood the logic behind everything.
Yeah, and I think as leaders, sometimes we feel that we can't show vulnerability. I think sometimes that's the most powerful tool because when you share vulnerability as a leader, I think what happens is your team themselves will try to rally to compensate for that vulnerability. We had a situation this year where we were talking about one of the challenges we're having in one of the specific markets that we're in terms of growing the revenue there and dealing with the impacts of COVID in a very specific place that only impacted one or two of our people. And I mentioned it in a group meeting as looking forward to 2021. We group meeting with the whole team, and I identified it as a challenge. And I kind of said, we don't really have a plan for this. We're trying to work on something to try to figure out how we're going to deal with this. And within the next week, I had 4 or 5 people not impacted by this situation at all stepping up and saying, we've been talking about how we can deal with this thing, and here are our ideas,
Mm.
not solicited by me, them coming up. And I think if I had approached it as saying, here's a situation, don't worry about it, we have a plan for it, it's going to be okay, there's no reason for those people to rally behind that.
Mm.
And so vulnerability, I think, as leaders, if it's coming from a genuine place, I think it's actually a very powerful tool and actually helps build the team.
Yeah, it
uh,
kind of takes the idea away that they themselves are victims and in fact puts them in the protagonist role, that they actually are going to be the heroes in the story and the way it unfolds, as opposed to waiting and taking direction and receiving guidance on what they need to do.
yeah,
It's a
yeah,
very powerful psychological
yeah,
idea that I what I do will actually change the game for everybody here. The way I behave, the way I conduct
yeah,
myself, the ideas I put on the table.
yeah. And then I think as a leader, you then have to have the humility to let them run with it.
Hmm.
And I think that's how you build a team. And I think when I reflect back to why did the team respond the way that they did in March? Because it could have gone either way, who knows, right? And I think you've actually got to think back to, well, what were you doing pre-pandemic?
Hmm.
What were the values? What were the things you were doing as a team? What were the things that you were doing as a leader? that maybe you weren't doing consciously, or obviously wasn't part of a strategy, because I didn't have a pandemic strategy before
Right.
April. But the behaviors and that you exhibited pre-pandemic, I think really had a big impact on how your team responded post-pandemic.
Mm,
And if you were able to be consistent in
mm,
terms of how you make decisions and your value system
mm.
pre and post pandemic, that's a big motivator for a team, right? Because if all of a sudden everything you had been preaching up until March
Yeah.
changed, right?
Yeah.
Because, well, now we're in a pandemic, so I'm not going to take care of you and I'm not going to do all the things that we've always done. I think that's a big downer.
Yeah.
But when you're consistent, I think that's what gives the team that confidence that, hey, yeah, you know what, this is going to be tough, but I kind of know how to behave, because I'm just going to behave the way that I've always behaved, because I know how the management team is going to respond,
Mm.
because that value system is still there.
I've talked to a lot of leaders, and most of them are saying that this time, this last several months, has amplified, I think, as you're saying, everything that was going on before. So if you had a weak strategy, not strong leadership, not resilient workforce, when the pandemic hits, it just exposes all those cracks and
Yeah.
actually really brings them to the surface, which also then creates an opportunity to address them because you can't ignore them now.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, if you had solid leadership in place, good communication, good health of the senior management team, you were able to respond with resiliency and, like you said, vulnerability and really navigate to pivot through the time. And so this kind of was a crucible moment, right? Of really highlighting those things that were good and those things that need to be addressed. And that's part of the good that came out of all of this for business.
Yeah. And I think looking forward beyond the pandemic, I think when I look at sort of relationships with customers, relationships with vendors, relationships with your team, they've all been strengthened,
Hmm.
because really we are really all going through this together. And I think all of those things have been strengthened, and I'm excited about how we build on that when we get to something resembling normal. I think there's a huge opportunity now, because everybody has learned. I think a lot of people on my team have surprised themselves at how well they've done through this. I think it's brought out strengths in them that they never knew they had. And now I think when we look forward, we say, now how do we give them the opportunity to continue to build on that? And that's good for them, but it's really good for the company too. It creates a
Absolutely.
ton of opportunity.
Absolutely. So we've had this long conversation about your leadership and how you've managed this time with your people. Why don't we fill our listeners in a little bit on what you do, your company, your role? Tell us a bit about what you're doing.
Sure. So our company is Hetek Solutions. So we're a wholesale distributor of fixed and portable gas detection instrumentation, water leak detection instrumentation, pipe and cable locating instrumentation. And then we also have a field service business where we do pipeline leak inspection for gas and water utilities. And we also have a mobile repair and calibration business. So we do a number of different things, which has actually been a bit of a savior for us, because a couple of those components of our business have been deemed essential. So we've fared better than a lot of other small businesses. My background is actually in finance. I was a commercial banker for a number of years, and then I was the vice president of international trade finance for HSBC in Western Canada up until 2007. And then I was at a point where I could see a career for myself in banking. But when I thought about it, it kind of said to myself, if I get hit by a truck tomorrow, the bank's just going to keep on going. They'll have a lunch.
Hmm.
A couple of people will say a few nice things about me, and then the bank will just keep on going. And when I thought about that, I thought, I don't really see the impact of what I'm doing every day. You and I really became close doing a lot of volunteer work. And I thought about the impact that we saw on what we did every day. And good, bad, or indifferent, the results of our decisions and our actions were evident pretty quickly, and we could see the impact that we were having. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to get that in banking. And I was thankfully at a place where I could afford to take some risk and dip my toe into something outside of kind of that corporate world. And I was very lucky to get connected with the chairman of our company, a gentleman by the name of Abel Saleh. He had a small business up in Edmonton that he had just bought. I was living in Calgary at the time. He needed somebody to go in there to try to turn it around. And it was one of those things, met on a Thursday, had a conversation on Friday, and I quit my job on Monday. And
Wow.
I'd never met this guy before. And this is the third business that we've done together now. And it's been a great relationship. And
Wow.
for me, kind of small, medium sized business is where I feel that I'm the most comfortable and where I feel like I can have the most impact and where I learn the most because there is no safety net that you get with a large corporate. You know that having gone through your career path as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how I got to where I am now. And we continue to look for opportunities to grow either organically or through acquisition and in the same space that we're in now.
Yeah. So you say small, medium-sized business, and oftentimes people think of small, medium-sized business and they think of really small businesses. But let's just make sure I understand the scope of your business. You do everything from design solutions, manufacture solutions, you have consulting capability, you have sales, you have service. And so it's a full range of operations you have. Am I right?
Yeah, we do very little consulting, but we do a little bit of fabrication in house. That's an area of our business we're trying to grow. But yeah, like just to give you a sense, the pipeline leak inspection services that we offer are very seasonal.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go from full-time staff of around 50 to around 80
Mm-hmm.
in May. And,
Yeah.
and that'll be the case through the summer.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the scope of what we do. We've got crews all across the country. We've got salespeople all across the country.
Yeah.
We've got vans across the country. So yeah, it's not mom and pop shop. But you ask me what I do every day, it's hard to answer that question because it really depends on what the business needs. And I think when you're running a small business, you have to have that mentality.
Yeah.
And obviously you have people in place to
Yeah.
do things. I don't come into my office every day and have sort of a prescribed list of things that I do. Small business is where you're, as the leader of a small business, I think you're responsible for the strategy and you're responsible for operations. And how you build your team to accomplish those two things will depend on the scope of what
Yeah.
you're doing. But yeah.
So you alluded to this earlier, how you and I got our start working as volunteers. And so let's set the context for everybody. First of all, we dived right into this conversation because one, obviously we're longtime friends. And
Yeah.
even though we might not talk to each other on a very regular basis, we're pretty much able to pick up anytime and just pick up where we left
Yeah.
off. So that's
Yeah.
why this conversation started
It-
so naturally. Secondly, you're actually a listener of my podcast. So thank you very much, a regular
yeah.
listener.
I learned all about Calendly from you, your podcast.
That's awesome. Thank you. And so thanks for being a listener. I might ask you some feedback at the end of this. But we got our start together, like really in our final years of university, right?
Yeah.
You were studying at UBC. I was studying at SFU. We were both studying business. And so we were very well connected just on that. But also, we just enjoyed each other's company and we would hang out and go out and
Yeah.
do things together. Our
Yeah. We've
office
been
was
there.
across the hold court at Earl's, and we'd have lots of discussions. And we'd analyze the customer service and the ability to upsell of Earl's staff. So
Yeah.
if the president of Earl's, who we both know is listening to this, we were watching your business back in the day. I'm
Yeah.
hoping to get him actually on a podcast, but he's busy right now. So we'll
Yeah.
have a chat with him another time.
Yeah.
But it'll be fun to share those stories with him. So we used to hang out, but you and I were part of a very interesting leadership experiment because we were both appointed pretty much in our final years and maybe or just after graduating from university on the executive of a volunteer, very, very active operating volunteer board. I don't know, 1,300 volunteers, 13,
Yeah.
14 community centers, major events throughout the year. And we were part of a shakeup. So the senior leader at the time, a woman that we both respect who is now passed on, basically wanted to change the culture of the volunteer organization from what was command, control, historic, which we'll talk about, to being modern, engaging, empowering. And she shook it up by appointing very young people onto this team. You and I were two of those people. And I'm not sure whether she knew what she was getting herself into when she appointed us, but we had a lot of fun. Basically, we saw it as a playground.
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah.
remember of that time?
Well, I often say to people is that everything I learned about running a business, I learned from that experience.
Mm.
So the things that I take away are one is Zainab, who you're speaking of. she took a huge risk on us. I don't know how much political capital and emotional capital she spent on us, but I'm pretty sure it was a lot.
Mm.
And she did two things. One is she took a big risk, and then she let us do our thing and let us make mistakes, and we made very many of them.
Hmm.
And she let us make those mistakes, she let us learn from them, and then she did an extremely good job of allowing us to do that while not compromising the actual operations of the organization, which, as you
Right.
say, was a huge thing. So she really let us try things. I think at some points she probably made us go a little bit slower than we wanted, but I think that was the right decision. But the big thing I take of her is just the risk that
Mm.
she took. And I think the reason why we were able to make some of the changes that we made and help that organization evolved, and it's evolved way beyond anything that we
Right.
did
Yeah.
since then, because all of us that were part of that experiment all shared a value system that allowed us to have disagreements, brainstorm ideas, communicate with our teams in a way that built instead of destroyed.
Right.
Historically, when we've bought businesses, we've bought turnarounds. And everything I've learned about how to do that is from that experience.
Yeah. I would say me too. Yeah. Zainab, we all called her affectionately Muni. She was a remarkable, remarkable woman. And you're absolutely right. Took big risks on us, supported us. She did have this ability to just look at us, engender a little bit of fear, but just enough fear to know that we needed to straighten up and change the way we were doing things. One of the
And she
things,
protected us too. I think when her colleagues around the sort of board table that she sat on and above and people that she reported to, I don't think we're always happy with what we were doing. And I honestly don't know where her belief in us came from.
right?
I don't remember doing anything to earn it, but she just said, "Hey, I'm going to put my arms around you guys and protect you." And I believe enough in what we're trying to accomplish here that I'm going to take all the heat. And the amount of loyalty that I think that generated from us was huge.
For sure. In fact, we had responsibility well beyond the responsibility we had in our day-to-day jobs, right? I was an
I wouldn't
entry level
hire myself to do that job today.
person. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know why we would have hired me when I was 21 or whatever.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Uh,
Because in our day, you were working at, I think, TD Bank at the time.
I think I was in my last year of university when we
Yeah.
first got appointed, and you
Yeah.
had just, I think, started at Mohawk.
Yeah. But you were working on the weekends at TD Bank.
Yeah, yeah,
And I was just starting up at Mohawk Oil as a bottom of the ladder position. But we had this enormous responsibility outside after hours in the community. And one of the things that was really interesting as I reflect back on that time is that we were brought in as these kind of people to change the culture. That's a lot of pressure to put on two young people, but we were up for it. We were excited about it. And we were probably a little bit arrogant, not arrogant in a negative sense, but we were bold. We wanted to make changes. But in order for us to have the roles that we had, it meant that other people that had put in years of service had been displaced
yeah,
from that leadership team. And part of our job we had to learn was how do you keep those people in the fold? Because the truth of the matter is they had experience and expertise that we did not have. And we had just taken their jobs. And so we had to find a way to kind of mend fences, build relationships, but at the same time, make some of the changes that they weren't making.
yeah.
Very interesting times. What did you learn from that kind of
Y-
experience?
Yeah, so I actually think when I reflect back on that time, that was one of the things that I think I did really poorly. I think I was so gung ho and committed to what we were trying to do that I didn't take into consideration or didn't have that respect for those years of service that you're mentioning. You know, it's interesting because we're trying to remove that command and control culture. But when I reflect back on that time, so much of what I think I did was more from that perspective of, hey, I'm in this position, so therefore I can, and not taking the time to build individual relationships and with people that had been there for a long time. And as I've progressed in my career, again, we're a group that buys other businesses. Hetek has been in existence since 1956. We bought it in 2011. And one of the things that I learned from that time that is very applicable to what I do now is coming into an organization that has this long history and has its own heroes of the company and stories of the company and all of that type of stuff. You can't just come in and, because you're the new owners or you're the new president or whatever it is you are, just come in and unilaterally change things without taking into consideration all of that history, all that culture, all those
Mhm.
stories, all those heroes, and embracing them and making them part of your story moving forward. And it's hard to do, especially in a corporate environment, because obviously you want to move very quickly, but it's important to do if you want to keep those good people on your side and build loyalty and have them trust you. And when I look back at that time, at least in the way I handled it, I don't think I spent the time to build those relationships so that those individuals actually trusted us.
Mm.
I think for a long time, that trust wasn't there. And that ultimately impacted how quickly we were able to move and how successful some of the initiatives that we were trying to implement were. And that's probably the biggest learning that I took from that.
Well, that's one of the reasons why I think we were such good friends and good partners because we balanced each other off very well. Perhaps I was not as fast moving or aggressive on some of the changes as you were. And I probably was a little bit more reflective and perhaps a bit empathetic of the feelings of the people that we were displacing at the
Yeah.
time. So maybe that's why we worked so well together.
Yeah. And I think, and it's interesting you say that because through that time and those Earl sessions,
Yeah.
there were some pretty heated conversations,
Yeah.
formally in meetings and informally. And I think back to some of those conversations, it's like, wow, we were like really, anybody watching from the outside would
Yeah.
think that we hated each other,
Yeah.
right? Because we were really going at it. And I think the reason why our friendship survived all of that and the reason why we ultimately, I think, were able to make better decisions was because through all of that, we had a shared value system.
Yeah.
And there was never a point where you would say something to me and I would think he's taking a shot at me.
Right.
I always trusted that he's got the best interests of the organization and our value system at heart. And
Yeah.
he's fighting for what he thinks are the most important things for the organization
Yeah.
and with that value system in mind. I think if we didn't have that trust in one another, that's where we were coming from. I don't think we would have lasted in those roles. One of us would have had to leave, and it probably would have been you because you were the nice one. And so I think if we didn't have that trust and
Yeah.
that shared value system, it would have been a bit of a gong show. Probably was a bit of a gong show for other people anyway, but
True.
but it was more of a gong show.
You know, I remember one of the things that because our friendship was so close, when I was getting married, I asked you to be the wedding coordinator because one of your talents was event management, operations management. I thought no one I trust more than with the high standards that my wife had, Narissa, than you. And so you were managing this thing. So shortly after we got married in our first days, we were living in our new house. I remember you called me up. It was a Saturday night and you called me up and said, I've got a plan I want to share with you. And I don't know if you remember this, but you showed up half an hour notice. You came, we sat in my new living room and you brought up this kind of typed up Word document on how you're going to transform the way the upcoming event was going to be run. And it was a bit of a shakeup. And part of it involved totally turning on its head some of those seasoned individuals that have been running things. And you were coming to me to kind of get my buy in because the next morning you wanted to go to one of those individuals who was a tough person and you had no issues going head to head with him. You were going to go the next day and have a conversation with him and say, this is how it's going to be done. And I remember listening to you because you were so passionate and excited. And I wanted to pull you back a little bit because I knew what the consequences would be. And I remember that was a heated conversation. And I remember having to struggle to choose my words carefully to not dampen your enthusiasm, but at the same time, out of a little bit of worry, probably for me and the team I ran, that if we upset this guy, it's going to have significant implications to the rest of the team. And I remember that conversation. I don't know how we ended up resolving it, but I think things did actually work out for the better. But I'll tell you what I admired from you at that stage. I don't remember the ages, but I think you're a couple of years younger than me. And that's not a big deal now, but in those days, it probably was. You were just out of school. I was a couple of years into my career. And one of the things I always admired about you was the amount of weight you could carry on your shoulders, the thick skin you had. You did not have any difficulty dealing with criticism or conflict or really kind of aggressive behavior from others. I was probably not as strong at that as you were. What was it? Like, what gave you that courage at that time to be able to stand up to people that were more senior to you, had more experience to you, were a little bit aggressive in their behavior? What was it that kind of gave you that at that young age?
I think some of it was just being a bit of a young dick for for lack of a better term. But I think it was the passion, like the volunteer organization had been a part of my life
Yeah,
and my family's life, well, my family's life for decades,
yeah,
for my life since my earliest memories
yeah,
are from volunteer work.
yeah.
And so when you have a passion for the work and you see the potential, and by the time we would have had this conversation, we would have been several months, if not a year and a bit, into developing this vision that we
Mhm,
had. And I think the reason why I was so kind of willing to fight for it, no matter what the consequences in some
mhm,
cases, was because of that belief in what we were trying to do. And
mhm,
that ultimately I thought, I know people aren't going to like this, but it's for their own good. It's for the betterment of the organization. I want other kids to have that experience that I had growing up in this organization, but they're not going to grow up in the time that I grew up in. They're going to have different options. Their
mhm,
parents are going to have different priorities than my parents had. But I think this organization can do so much good for so many people
mhm.
that it has to change. And then the other part of that is the ego of it has to change, and the changes that I want to do are the right ones. And so I'm going to fight for it.
Yeah,
And to be honest, if you hadn't been there
yeah,
providing that yin to the yang or whatever, it wouldn't have worked because my approach it was not people driven. It was totally process driven. And you absolutely have to have process, right? You have in our company now, we have to have process, we have to have quality assurance, we have to have audit, we have to have all of these things, right? But at the end of the day, if you don't have the people, none of that other stuff matters. And I would have, and probably did, totally ignore the people part of it.
right.
It's interesting in a volunteer organization, and especially that specific volunteer organization, HR is unlimited.
Right. The availability of manpower was unlimited.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and people already had a emotional attachment because I mean it's community and religion based. People already had that emotional attachment, and so from looking back on it, I think my whole approach was, well, if they don't like it, somebody else is going to want to do that job anyway.
Yeah.
So who cares?
Yeah.
Which is totally wrong. That's not good,
Yeah.
right? And again, it's a big learning because today, yeah, absolutely, quality is important, process is important, but the people are what's the most important. And it's interesting where Adil and I were looking at a deal not so long ago, and when we were looking at some of the initial due diligence, we saw that this company had very high turnover in their sort of technical field services group.
Yeah.
And my initial assessment was that they really don't pay market. They're kind of cheap in the way that they pay their people. And then when I did a little bit more due diligence, I said, well, actually, their pay is actually pretty good. And I remember having the conversation with Adil. I was like, this was just a matter of pay. This is an easy problem to solve,
Yeah.
right? Because you just increase everybody's pay a little bit,
Yeah.
right? But when I realized it's not pay, that's a way more difficult problem
Mhm.
to solve.
Mhm.
And so as again, that whole experience that we had in our early 20s, now I will take a peak performer that doesn't fit with the values and culture that we're trying to build. And I would much rather replace them with a person that doesn't have the same technical skill, but that
Mhm.
does everything else because I can teach the technical stuff.
Mhm.
I can't, other
Yeah.
people can.
Well,
But
it's so
yeah,
interesting to hear that narrative and your journey because I'll tell you, my journey was probably the mirror image of that because I started off with so much of a focus on one of the things that you both you and I had in common was what was a whole view around engaging youth, young people, particularly disenfranchised youth. We wanted to bring them in and saw this as an opportunity. So we agreed on that. We agreed on the fundamentals of strategy,
yeah,
how to plan, how to move forward, how to engage a group of people to generate creative ideas with an end in mind. So we agreed on those things. But you articulated really well. You were much more process driven and operationally driven, and I was probably much more people driven. You, over your career, picked up the importance of the people aspect of things and learned those
yeah,
skills. I, on the opposite, ended up learning more of the process and the operational side of things. And I ended up doing a stint of management consulting and process design and KPIs and
yeah,
measurement and all of those things. And then ended up becoming a general manager of a supply chain business and ended up becoming a COO. But I've landed on the other side back to where I started, people, leadership development, all of that stuff. But I recognize now that I had to build up those business operational skills, the courage and the strength and the ability to have difficult conversations and confront brutal facts. I had to build it. There's no escaping it. If you're going to be a leader, you actually have to have both sides of things. You learned one side, I learned the other.
Yeah. And I think one of the other interesting things that I've learned is back then when we were new leaders earning our stripes, and I don't know if you felt this way, but I felt that the senior people, these people that had been around for a long time, because especially in that organization, some of those people that had been around for a long time and did the work were silent,
Right.
right? They just wanted to do the work. They would never come and tell you they were upset or anything like that. And I always felt that I don't need to worry about managing those people
Hmm.
because they're senior, they know what they're doing, they're going to be fine. What I've learned over the years is even your most senior people need to be led and managed
Hmm.
differently than the way that you're leading and managing less senior people, but they need to be led and managed. And part of the challenges that I have as you get into sort of more senior roles and you're having people report to you is now you have to build a culture by coaching other people to manage their people the way that you want them to and with the values and the
Right.
culture that you want. That's really hard. And it's something that I've realized that you can have the best operator ever and you can bring them into your organization or you can promote them from within or do whatever you're going to do, but you can't then assume as the leader that they're going to be able to just run their thing without you having to lead and manage. Because I think back then, part of our thought process was, or at least mine was, we just have to create the environment,
Yeah.
right? The people will do their thing. Now I've learned that, yeah, you absolutely need to create an environment, but you also have to coach and manage if you want to build a culture throughout the organization. And that's a different skill set than managing grassroots or operational.
Yeah, I have to say, had to learn that too. You're right. We both believe that it was important to create that empowerment, that culture, the spirit, the power of a morning motivational talk early in the morning when we're doing an event. I thought was it. If you did that right and everybody was, you had the right people around you. And I do agree that is true. But you're absolutely right, is that I remember it was as recent as maybe 8, 9 years ago when I communicated the strategy. I wrote it down on paper. We engaged people and then we communicated it out. And then, 3 months goes by and people are doing stuff that is completely counter to the strategy, going out and acquiring customers that actually weren't the customers we were supposed to be targeting based on our strategy. I was like, I don't understand. We were all in the same room. And that's when I realized that you can't just say something once. You can't just say something 2 times. You probably have to say it every day while you are executing a strategy. And I
Yeah.
learned that as well, the same way you did, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think going back even before you actually put that strategy in paper, I try to say this to my team often is two things. One, I don't actually do anything. Other people actually do stuff.
Right.
And two, they know more about our customers, more about our competitors, more about what's going out, what the conditions are out in the field and everything else
Really.
way better than I do. And so for me to put that strategy to paper without taking the time to understand that where they're coming from automatically makes that strategy to them totally disassociated
Right.
thing from their day-to-day life. And I think the challenge is learning enough about the operational circumstances to develop that strategy in a way that they see your people see some of their input in that.
Yes.
The flip side of that is, as leaders, I think our job is to get the best information that we can from anywhere we can get it, filter it, and then make a call.
Yeah.
But if you've got input from five different people,
Yeah.
filtering it and making a call, chances are three of those five people are not going to be happy, right? Or
Right.
two
Yeah.
and a half of them aren't going to be happy anyway. That's the whole challenge of even developing that strategy. And again, going back to the volunteer situation, we started from a place where, because we'd been volunteers, we both grew up in the organization. We assumed we already had all that operational knowledge, but we had that operational knowledge from a very narrow
Yeah.
lens because before that we had no responsibility whatsoever, right? And we went from having no responsibility whatsoever to having all of this responsibility, and we were looking at things from a lens that didn't encompass the entire scope of the organization. We needed to take the time to go to the people that knew all of those other
Yeah.
things in order to develop a good strategy. And I think we probably didn't do a great job of that, which probably was a bit of a hiccup at the start.
Yeah. Well, one of the things you look back and realize that not only did we have to try to transform the culture, but we actually had an organization and operations to run. Like this was an active portfolio. And so we had to keep things running while making change happen and trying to do both at the same time without respecting and thinking and navigating those times is really something that I think probably relevant right now. A bit of a different time this time because we kind of had to stop a little bit and reposition. And this was an interesting opportunity to actually completely transform the way things were being done because we did have to stop. But usually in life, we don't have that luxury. Things have to keep on
Yeah.
going while we make changes. I can't believe we've been talking for an hour already and time has really flown, but in some ways I'm not surprised. It's like I said, pick up where we left off. But I do want to ask you one thing. If you were to give advice to an up and coming leader, let's say a new president, what would you tell them that is really important about navigating the next several years?
Oh, wow. I think lesson number one is exactly what we've been talking about is the Internet of Things, access to data, all of that stuff is only going to become more prevalent. And I think there's sometimes when data is so accessible, and I don't know if I speak for all leaders, but I know for me, I love data,
Hmm.
right? Because data, the more data I have, the better decisions I can make. The more data I have, the more I can analyze it and say, look at what happened and develop my strategy going forward. So I think the number one lesson is absolutely take advantage of all of that stuff. But just like we've been talking about, all of that means nothing without your people. So you have to have a strategy, and all of us have different strengths and weaknesses. You have much more empathy than I do and can communicate that way better than I can. It's not one of my strengths, but I think it's important for leaders to say, okay, when you're managing your people, what aren't your strengths and work on them? And it's something that I'm constantly working on. I still have a tendency to fly off the handle every once in a while, but it's something that you have to continue to work on. And so you need to understand what are your strengths and weaknesses as a leader when it comes to dealing with the people, because chances are, especially if you're a founder, your technical skills and your understanding of the market and everything else are going to be excellent. The tough part is learning how to manage the people because your capacity to grow
Yeah.
is limited by your ability to engage people. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing, and this is something that I've learned, and it might be a little bit counterintuitive for podcasts like this one, is understanding that it's very possible to ignore the really important things when you're trying to build a business.
Yeah.
And for each of us, those really important things are going to be different. But I think it's important to take inventory sometimes of what are all of those other important things. And am I setting aside time for them? Because as I've grown older, that's one thing where you sort of say is, well, I'm working really, really hard. Ultimately, what's the end in mind? And for all of us, the answer to that question is going to be different, but I think you have to know what that is and you have to pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's a really good one. And one of the other people I interviewed called it having a compass, knowing where
Yeah.
you're going, having the
Yeah.
direction in mind where you're working. It's really important. I mean, it was great talking to you. You
Thanks
gave
for
me
inviting me.
Oh no, it was great to have you, particularly because it was created an opportunity for us to catch up on so many things that we both experienced at a young age and compare notes and really emphasize lessons for others. The other thing we reinforced is how much young people can grow and learn by getting involved in volunteer roles. Most of your leadership lessons came from that time and in those roles. And coming into a time where the future is uncertain for a lot of young people as to what jobs they can get and how challenged they can be, is there's going to be plenty of need for volunteers to lead us through this time. And some of the greatest opportunities and lessons will come from that work. So thanks for sharing that. Wishing you, your family, all the best. I know you would normally go home and see your mom during this time, and that's going to be a challenge, but please give her my love when you speak to her.
Yeah, we'll do. And give my regards to Nurse and the kids.
Will do.
And we'll chat soon.
Awesome.
Okay.
Take care. Well, that conversation felt just like the conversations we used to have at Earl's so many years ago. We used to talk about leadership and the lessons we were learning way back then. So here's the big things I took away from this conversation. First of all, Amin talked a lot about the importance of vulnerability and transparency. And he said that, being vulnerable and honest with the team brings out the best in them. By being honest about what leaders don't know, you not only get the best of your team, but you empower them and take their focus off what they are going through and help them become the heroes in the story of the organization. Number two, value the history of the organization and people, particularly when you are inheriting a new leadership role or entering a new scenario. Make sure that you respect where the people have come from, what they've done in the past, respect the organization's leaders in the past, and trust that everybody wants to do the right thing going forward and give them that chance to do that. He also talked about leveraging the knowledge of the team, that as a leader, oftentimes we can get into a place where we feel like we know all the answers or need to know all the answers. Remember that likely your team knows more than you do about your customer, about suppliers, about markets, about the way things work. And engage them, bring them into the fold when you are making decisions and making plans. I have to say, I'm particularly proud of my friend for how honest he has been in his self reflection, to learn from his mistakes, and for recognizing the areas of leadership that he needs to continue to develop. And he recognizes it's an ongoing effort. So, thank you for joining me in that conversation. I hope it was helpful to you. And I also want to say Happy New Year. I hope that this year brings you lots of new opportunities to learn, new opportunities to challenge yourself. And it's a successful year with good health and happiness and prosperity. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share it. I want to say thank you to one of my favorite bands, Late Night Conversations, for sharing their song Chaos with me and letting me use it in this episode. You can learn more about them on Instagram at LNC Connected. And here's more of their song Chaos to take you out.
Far behind my eyes, mediation, suffocation, it'll break me. Information in the skies. But when your eyes finally found mine, you were there, but I'm defined by the chaos in my mind. I believe what I perceive is a weave tearing at the seams, and I wonder what's behind. And my ears are bleeding, and the reasonings and the logic of the season, taking the pleasing from my soul and leaving me to die. And I feel the lacing, LNC like racing on stationary animation, take